Hi guys, welcome back to the workshop. Today we've got something really interesting in store for you. We are going to begin work on a multi-part series on making a North Star pin. Now this pin is going to have an amethyst set in it, it's going to be made of silver, and it's not going to be too unlike this one here. I made this a couple of years ago, and it is a swift pin, one of my favorite birds. And with that, let's get into it.
On this older pin, I want to point out that while its surface is polished, a few corners were hard to reach, and we will need to consider this in our future design of this pin.
Alright, so we have our workbench here obviously, but no real place to do any jeweler smithing on. Now, we're going to take this block of wood and mount it here, cut a little V into it, and by doing that we'll have a nice place to sort of mount our workpiece on and be able to file it like crazy, because most of jeweler smithing turns out is a lot of file work. So let's get to it.
Starting off, we need to cut down this piece of wood to about 6 inches. This particular piece of wood came from this table and was used to make the bracing underneath. So with that in mind, let's clamp this down to the table, and then we can begin to cut it off using a handsaw. This whole process shouldn't take very long, and will be a nice arm workout. To start this cut, I made sure to do some long, just back pulls. That way the teeth would cut very shallowly into this piece of wood, and I would get a nice clean cut. Arguments spinning in circles, we're fighting for days, stuck in a phase. I think we're losing the reason. One word is all it takes, babe, bursting out in cold flames. Breathing, we are catching fire. Thought that we were wiser, going like the match, breathing, we are catching fire. Sanding the cut edge of this was rather simple. I just used some 180 grit sandpaper and made sure to cut down some of the corners. That way I wouldn't get any splinters from this piece of wood, and it would be safe to handle. It also allows for a nice glue up surface in the future. With our piece clamped down in the spot we wish it to be, I'm now just drilling some holes from underneath the table. It's pretty cramped down here, and doesn't make things easy, but we'll get there in the end. On a relatively minor note, this is not very important as we're underneath the table, but I always like to chamfer my screw holes. I just like the way the screws meet the surface of the wood this way. With our holes drilled, I then unclamped the piece of wood from the table and denotated a couple of marks on there for our little V that we'll use for our jewelry making. Now, hindsight being 2020, I really wish I did the glue up to this piece before actually mounting it on the table and drilling those holes, because it made the alignment a little bit more challenging, and this could have been avoided altogether. Arguments spinning in circles, we're fighting for days, stuck in a phase. I think we're losing the reason. One word is all it takes, babe, bursting out in cold flames. Breathing, we are catching fire. Thought that we were wiser, going like the match, babe. Now, as I said, realigning this was a bit of a challenge, but I made sure to pay very close attention and also marked it out ahead of time. So if you want to go this route, you may absolutely do so, and it will turn out fine. Silent treatment ain't no cure, just making it harder. Keep on acting busy on your phone. I just wanna feel your touch, baby, can we stop this? Don't you wanna hold me anymore? Arguments spinning in circles, we're fighting for days, stuck in a phase. I think we're losing the reason. And we're back, rather awkwardly under the table again. Now my drill driving these screws home did skip a few times, but it's to be expected in this small environment. Now these screws are of the 4-inch variety and should hold our little block of wood onto the table long into the future. To give our table even more support, we're back on top of the table now, and we'll be driving some shorter screws into the surface. Now, with these screws being on top of our table, we will have to make them flush, and to do that, we will chamfer our screws just like we did underneath. With our block of wood now nicely secured, we can go ahead and cut our little V out. I'm just using a coping saw to do this, and didn't take me too long. And with the magic of editing, things often go much quicker. Arguments spinning in circles, we're fighting for days, stuck in a phase. I think we're losing the reason. One word is all it takes, babe. Bursting out in cold flames, breathing, we are catching fire. Thought that we were wiser. Go and light the match, babe. Miss out of the good days. Breathing. With our V now cut into this piece of wood, we can now sand its surface, rounding all of the edges and ensuring a nice, smooth, comfortable surface to work on. Look at that, all nice and smooth. Finally, on to carving our wax. We're gonna need a few things. We've got some jewelry saws, a coping saw, a whole ton of files, but our biggest thing is this Ferris File-A-Wax. This is a jewelry specific wax, and we also need our design. So this is our design. It's a 8-pointed star and should look pretty nice in the end. The stone we'll be setting in is this amethyst. After laying out our design onto the surface of a wax block, we can then begin to cut it out. Now, I don't have a wax specific saw for this, which you can get for jewelry, and I'm sure that would be much easier, but I just used a coping saw and it worked pretty well. Probably a little less efficient and a little bit more messy, but nothing the little files can't fix. So I'll just cut the rest of this out and get going. So it pays to be pretty careful during this whole process. I made sure that I wasn't cutting too close to my lines, and where things sort of got a little bit close, I definitely kept my blade at a 90-degree angle. That way I wasn't cutting in any strange shapes into the bottom of my wax piece. A tilted blade would result in perhaps removing material from a section of the piece that I really need to be there. Anyway, finally onto getting our files out. I'm just using a flat, actually metal working file to remove this wax, and we're just trying to get as close to our lines as possible, if not exactly there. From time to time, as you saw there, I use a jeweler's saw to cut off small segments, again getting as close to the line as possible. This whole stage is pretty important as it will be our starting point for actually finishing the design. Any areas that we haven't removed will be infinitely harder to remove later on during our metalworking phase. So it's important to get this as precise as possible and as nice as possible before that happens. these interior segments where our smaller points sort of meet up with the larger ones, it was basically impossible to get a file in there. So I ended up having to resort to my saw and cut as close to that line as possible. Again, super important to keep that blade at a 90-degree angle. That way I'm not cutting in any strange shapes and not screwing up my design. It's easier to do straight cuts when you're paying very close attention. Last cut and a little bit of filing, but look at all of this file dust that we've made. It's crazy.
All right, so we finally have our cutout done, and our outline is now complete and into this wax. Now their next steps are going to be to isolate the facets along each of these lines and hopefully get a very smooth outcome.
So for this next phase of our piece, I'm doing my best to keep my file at about a 30-degree angle or so, maybe 45 in some places, but the important thing is to keep it consistent across the whole surface of the piece. We want to create some nice even facets, and slight angles are really going to affect that. You'll notice that I can't actually get very close on some of these pieces with this file. So instead of using a file for the majority of this, I actually opted to use a scalpel blade instead. This is not the best idea, as I can very easily remove too much at a time, so I made sure to take things really, really slow and get each of my cuts in there at the right angles, removing just as much as I needed. Now, while I'm working with this scalpel, you'll see a lot of back and forth. Basically, I'm just trying to make sure that center line is right in the middle and has not sort of wobbled back and forth. Also, I'm trying my best to carve down certain segments. So in our drawing of this piece, you'll actually notice that the smaller points sit on top of the larger ones. So I'm making sure to cut down those pieces as much as is needed. Finally cutting our top facets now. I make a couple of incisions in the wax to make sure my cuts end at a nice point. This is very important, that way I don't cut too far into the piece, and that way I don't make these elements sort of carve down into the piece with too much back and forth, which would happen if I was, not being very careful. This is our final cut to do, so I'm just trying to clean up that interior angle, and with this we're complete, at least on the surface. Our part is now, and still is, much too thick, so we need to file down the back end of it. With some sandpaper on our nice little jeweler's station here, I filed it back and forth, but even though this is an 80 grit sandpaper, I kind of realized it was taking too long. So I thought there was a better idea, and I turned to my potter's wheel. Big mistake.
Well, this piece is well and truly done. I don't think there's any putting this back together. I know it's wax, but this wax, if you melt pieces onto it, it usually just fractures at where the pieces were melted together. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we'll just recarve this from scratch, and I think there's a few things we can do a little bit better, namely drawing out all the lines. I had a lot of issues with the smaller points, so if we get that right from the start, I think it'll be much better going. So with that said, thank you all so much for watching, and if there's anything you'd like to see made, write it down in the comments. Bye guys.